I'm very happy to introduce you to our next speaker. She is our dear Keren Levina. She holds a degree from Harvard University in philosophy and Judaism. Currently, she completing a degree in philosophy and education at Teachers College in Columbia University in New York. The paper Mrs. Levina will be presenting her final thesis work, overseen by Professor David Hassan, the Director of Philosophy and Education Program at Teachers College, which is the oldest and leading school for education in the United States. The title of her presentation is Towards an Education of Truth as a Vital Remedy in the Era of a Global Crisis. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you, Cynthia. Right, so as Cynthia just said, the paper is titled Towards an Education of Truth as the Vital Remedy in an Era of Global Crisis. So as we've seen in the video, the introductory video to the conference, and as we all know, the world in 2021 is plunging deeper into various unresolvable crises. I don't know if people have seen the latest report by the United Nations that states there is a code red for humanity and the alarm bells are deafening, and that something should be done immediately. And the United Nations report proposes solutions such as greenhouse gas reductions, kind of what I would argue are external solutions. And my kind of main argument in my philosophic work is that there are alternative internal solutions to resolving this crisis, and philosophic wisdom shows that. And in this regard, I believe modern science also supports this idea, and I do hope we can do some interdisciplinary work in our research institute to sort of integrate philosophy and science to maybe present a more interdisciplinary explanation of this alternative path of human development and to crisis resolution in our modern era. So again, the sort of external solutions being proposed and practiced by mainstream approaches, I would argue, are showing that fundamentally novel tactics and approaches are needed. Again, I'm not a scientist, but I believe modern scientific advances have revealed the causal connection between the human being, the observer, or the consciousness, and the phenomenological or material world. Yet there are still no significant or mainstream efforts to improve the condition of the physical world through improving the observer, the human being, or the consciousness. I think the lack of such mainstream efforts in this direction is because this idea of changing the human being to change the human being's reality has been too avant-garde. It's not intuitive, and it's actually antithetical to the habitual approaches that are continuing by inertia, even though they've proven ineffective. This idea also appears irrational because I would argue it's founded on an antithetical rationality, one that recognizes untapped internal resources of the human beings as opportunities for salutary transformation. And I think it is therefore exactly the kind of new idea that is needed once other tactics are conclusively exhausted. Another reason for the lack of discourse and major campaigns in this direction is the shortage of guides, texts, textbooks to facilitate a simple and practical access to this approach. Because how do you change the human being to improve the world rather than manipulating external realities? But philosophic wisdom that has been developing, for thousands of years does offer this kind of wisdom. As mentioned earlier, its values and approaches have been too avant-garde, detached from the interests of the common man and from the natural reason of the dominant materialistic mind and logic. Also, these philosophic texts are often too difficult, too complex, and insufficiently accessible for broad appeal. And sufficient work has not been done to explicate and market them, so they could serve as educational guides on a broad scale. And additionally, there has not been an overwhelming need for societal leaders and the masses to venture into this abstruse direction, which appears alien to the basic natural reason and the habitual ways of the world. So these philosophic guides or teachers offer an alternative path of human development. And I think these are the illustrious philosophic minds that have speckled the enormous and monotone canvas of humanity as tiny but very bright sparks. And they've been around since antiquity till modernity. And they've exemplified that a different way of life and primarily a different way of thought is possible. And, exemplified by these philosophers, they were always unique in the context of their surrounding societies, while the whole world around them pursued primarily materialistically oriented pursuits and forms of development. These unique individuals stood apart from the rest, and they engaged in parallel metaphysically oriented investigation and self-cultivation of an internal evolution and realization of their internal human potential. As a result of this inquiry, they were imparted with visions or experiences of reality in newly discovered higher or metaphysical forms. And they also demonstrated that a different lifestyle is possible that takes place primarily in the realm of extended consciousness that penetrates metaphysical layers of reality. Now, I want to explain my terminology for a minute. So for purposes of this work, materialistic just refers to phenomenon activities that are not metaphysical, which includes intellectual and mental engagements that are detached from the metaphysical. Its main characteristics are falsehood, dualism, disparity or separation, egocentrism, narrowness, finitude, and confinement of perception of reality to the individual self. As opposed to this metaphysical, will be explained throughout the rest of this work, but it is antithetical to all that is materialistic, and its characteristics include truth, universal oneness, timelessness, infinity, perfection, continuity, integrality, connection, and perception of reality outside of the individual self. So again, these philosophers who engaged in this metaphysical inquiry, their sort of discoveries resulted in a distinctive kind of education that extended from them to their surrounding societies, sort of beckoning others to partake in this sublime metaphysical knowledge and experience that they have attained. And I think they were like pioneers or explorers that opened up this narrow trail that they themselves had walked, leading to the summit of what the human being can know and experience. And they've left this trail open and available to others through the education provided in their texts. At the same time, these philosophic texts, this wisdom, is it's still too complex to serve as a practical educational guide, and it's inefficiently accessible to those without philosophical training or access to such training. Therefore, further elucidation, simplification, and popularization is needed for this philosophical wisdom to assume a form of practical education that can be implemented broadly. I believe these philosophers' achievements, again, I'm going to the next section of my work now, which is explaining the vital importance of philosophy as education now in this period we are in. So I think these philosophers' achievements and educational approaches have never been as important for society as they are today. In the past, they were perhaps just fascinating texts to read, or maybe a kind of entertainment to receive an impression from these texts. And even for serious students and scholars that engage in these texts, they are often material for intellectual engagement of the materialistic mind, that are kind of used to draw conclusions for manipulating external realities, such as political systems, judicial systems, but rarely have they been applied for the values they actually profess and entreat others to follow, which is internal metaphysical self-cultivation and self-transformation of the human being. And today, these texts are taking on a different role and significance. These avant-garde internal approaches to human development and societal progress are becoming increasingly necessary to ensure society's continued development and flourishing, because there are new conditions in the world. So the dominant kind of external development pursued by society has reached an impasse, as evidenced by the overwhelming global challenges that are now threatening the very existence of life on Earth. The United Nations are saying this now, which is kind of, I think, unprecedented. The way forward can be derived from this vast philosophic wisdom, which has hitherto been the domain of only a handful of singular individuals who engaged in it. Also, this all-encompassing nature of the materialistic crises, I think, can be taken as a signal that human beings are being pushed out of this materialistic realm of development, which has exhausted itself into the metaphysical realm. And I think it invites the idea of apocalypse, which is an ancient Greek concept that refers to the revelation of great knowledge in the world, accompanied by the world's transition to a different and higher form. So this sort of idea of the end of the world and emergence of a superior world through the revelation of great knowledge refer to the extension of the human consciousness to metaphysical realms that were discovered by the philosophers. The internal changes of human perception would result in a new experience of reality that would resolve the pressures and problems posed by reality to the human being. So this tangible form of the world, whether it is a world of crises, natural cataclysms, and mortality, or a world of security, beauty, and timelessness, are also epistemological constructs, meaning they're determined by the extent of human knowledge of reality. And again, this apocalyptic notion of the end of the world and emergence of a new world with revelation of new knowledge is consistent, with framing this process as an epistemological one, or a process of expanding human knowledge. the difference between this sort of higher and metaphysical perception of reality and its perception in the materialistic plane alone is so vast that the allegory of birth is appropriate. Birth of the human being into metaphysical perception. There have been other allegories used that, for example, an allegory by Socrates, who says it's like a fish that has spent its life in the ocean and suddenly it rises up to discover a great, beautiful world on the outside. Other, allegories from more popular culture in fiction, literature, and cinema depict an escape to far regions of outer space and resettlement of the human race in sort of new worlds and dimensions. And the Earth itself has been sort of quoted as being a spaceship on its journey to discovering new worlds. These kind of allegorical depictions that I think reflect the deep-seated urge of the human spirit to venture into this realm that is vaster and more multidimensional than the one it currently occupies, and that the Earth itself necessitates humanity's escape into this vast new realm. So, as I mentioned previously, when sort of the pressures and crises in the material world become as overwhelming as the ones the world is now starting to encounter, and materialistic or external means of resolving them become insufficient, it becomes a necessity to propel human development in the realm of the human consciousness to the metaphysical layers of reality as the only remaining avenue of progress and crisis resolution. Thus, philosophic wisdom becomes the most needed and valuable type of information and education in the world today. Now, again, as I mentioned, philosophic wisdom, in its classical form is too complex and inaccessible. So I'm referring to kind of extracting the essence and values of philosophic wisdom to make them available to the broad public. So again, to elaborate also simple, practical, and educational approaches for all sectors of the public that would make this wisdom widely accessible. Now, in this next section, I'm actually going to address some of this metaphysical values and sort of the essence of this philosophical wisdom. Now that we've considered sort of the importance and relevance of philosophic wisdom, as well as its antithetical position to like the mainstream external approaches. So now I want to look at some central and common themes that have been illuminated by the investigations of the most landmark philosophers throughout history, and to inform how this wisdom can be used as an educational guide for broad application. So the landmark kind of philosophic texts throughout the millennia present a unified view that reality, as experienced by the vast majority of people in the course of their lives, is a misleading and false picture. And I just want to make a note about the terminology here. Falsehood and truth in this context do not necessarily refer to objectivity, but how this is perceived by the observer or by the investigator, that upon the discovery of these metaphysical or higher forms of reality, the perceiver assesses it as a true reality, and the insight that the prior reality, the materialistic reality, had been false or even non-existent. So it's kind of the notions of truth and falsehood are determined by the researcher's assessment of their own experience when they juxtapose the prior and the new personal experience or knowledge of the world. So again, these philosophers say that kind of the dominant perception of reality is false and misleading, and that there's another truth of reality than what appears to the eyes. that is far more significant, vast, and beautiful, and towards whose discovery it is worthwhile to strive. And the way to do that is to cultivate higher human faculties, which are described as being held in the soul, as well as in the potentialities of social and moral faculties, or in virtuous connections among individuals in society. Now, this common theme, I'm going to talk about how it's been discussed by Plato and Socrates, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, and James and Dewey. Again, the sort of practical measures they discuss for doing this is overcoming metaphysical or egocentric barriers that separate individuals in society, and in place of these barriers, instilling a new moral sensitivity or the capacity to experience reality through others or through connection with others or caring attitudes towards others. Then one's non-bodily eyes and senses open up to an experience of a metaphysical truth or an authentic reality, which is meaningful, fulfilling, and authentic, and an experience that is felt beyond a narrow individualistic self and beyond time, space, causality, and the physical reality. So again, they say one characteristic of this sort of hidden reality is truth that contrasts it from the false or erroneous reality preceding its discovery. And it also entails an opposition to the norms and practices of educational and other social institutions that were established for the pursuit of other aims and the transformation of these institutions. I just want to check my time because okay, I'm good. So John Dewey urges that education systems and methods should thus undergo a shift of their governing values and priorities, so that education will be centered on the social and moral realm of human life. And he argues that the foremost task of all educational processes is to instill positive, moral, giving, or caring interpersonal capacities, because these provide a means of epistemological and experiential progress towards the truth of reality. And this kind of education cultivates social interactions and social knowledge that is felt as an expanding experience of continuity, an all-inclusive connection between people and between people and everything in the world. Now, I want to pause for a moment on John Dewey's concept of continuity, which is to him the true state of reality. So continuity, which he also calls integrality, is the total and harmonious connection between all elements of the world, especially its most important social elements or people. And in the state of continuity, all elements of reality are equal in worth and are included in one another. And there are no contradictions or oppositions between any of them. Again, continuity is the true state of reality, and it's achieved when an individual or a society develops to this advanced perception, penetrating the deepest layers of nature that may be accessed only by the human consciousness that has realized its potentialities. I want to kind of start with Plato and Socrates now. I want to get into the kind of specifics of each of these philosophers' work now, starting with Plato and Socrates. So Socrates is sort of known as the father of philosophy, and he attained the peak of his sort of philosophical attainment moments before his death. Now, his death was issued by his society legally through the court for the dangerous crime of teaching philosophy that was too radical or true for the time. And one of the most famous philosophical texts by Socrates is called Phaedo in the Dialogues, which was written by Plato. So Plato kind of wrote down Socrates' wisdom in this text, Phaedo. So this text documents his final philosophical findings, where again he imparts that there's a reality that is vast and far more beautiful and worthwhile than the one people normally investigate and experience. And he says that the pitfall of most researchers who investigate reality is that they rely on their original physical senses to examine things. But according to Socrates, true knowledge, experience, and information about reality can only be obtained through a different tool of investigation called the soul, which requires deliberate cultivation. And until one cultivates such perceptive capacities of the soul, where one could clearly say that what one now feels is the truth, one undergoes continual internal development, always rejecting whatever knowledge one's materialistic mind and senses have grasped and seeking more conclusive information. Now, I do want to quote a few excerpts from this text by Socrates, where he depicts this higher metaphysical reality that is discovered in this deliberately cultivated sense of the soul. Now, he uses allegories or kind of mystical descriptions, which I think signals that this metaphysical reality cannot quite be verbally conveyed in the same way that physical experiences are. And I think these allegories, should not be sort of interpreted literally, but as imaginative guides, directing others to sort of discover that for themselves. So my first quote from Phaedo, Socrates says, investigation through the eyes is full of deceit, as is that through the ears and other senses. Philosophy then persuades the soul to withdraw from the senses and to trust whatever reality existing by itself, the soul itself understands, and not to consider as true whatever it examines by other means. The next quote from the same text, Socrates says, living in a certain hollow of the earth, we believe that we live upon its surface. We are unable to make our way to the upper limit of the air. If anyone got to this upper limit, if anyone came to it, he would know that there is the true heaven, the true light, and the true earth. Those things above are in their turn far superior to the things we know. And this final quote, those who have purified themselves sufficiently by philosophy make their way to even more beautiful dwelling places, which it is hard to describe clearly. One must make every effort to share in virtue and wisdom in one's life, for the reward is beautiful and the hope is great. So again, I think these are exquisite aphorisms by Socrates that summarize the peak of his philosophical attainment, that speak of a truth and a reality that is far superior, more beautiful, and worthwhile than the one experienced by those who have not cultivated this special kind of perception. And according to Socrates, only a special philosophical process of purification, and I would say of a certain kind of education, can be a means for developing such faculties. So again, Socrates was a thinker whose work became an impetus for many developments of Western civilization as a whole. And again, he urges people to make every effort during their lives to pursue this great sublime purpose of coming to know the true reality of which he speaks. And I think what's striking about Socrates' texts is how accessible they are, as if one is conversing with a close friend. Although he speaks about things that may be removed from the average person's circle of interests. When one begins to read his texts, one is drawn in a way that starts to feel natural or intuitive. I think they reverberate with, one's spirit, perhaps reawakening a forgotten childhood wonder and awe at all that the world and one's own internality as a human being has to offer. And in this text, Phaedo, Socrates shares his own childhood wonder and at the hidden mystery of the world, and his sort of curiosity that paved the way to this research. And I think most people could relate to this childhood wonder, even if it has been forgotten. And Socrates imparts that, as a kind of curious youth, he was drawn to discover true knowledge, and particularly the primary cause of reality. But as probably happened with most of us as children, the truth and knowledge he thought was not taught by any adults or teachers. It was not the subject of the exact sciences or any other learning, even by the best teachers of his time. So having found no other teacher or subject of study to satisfy this innermost desire for truth and of the primary cause, Socrates became a pioneer of philosophy, kind of blazing this trail towards the truth he thought, and again, leaving that trail open through his texts. And the plot twist of Socrates' life was that it was precisely for this authentic, pioneering work of learning and teaching the truth and inspiring others to do the same that his society handed him the death penalty. So I think this historical fact of Socrates' life and death lays bare the opposition and even danger that devotion to truth poses to its antecedent, the grip of falsehood and deceit, as well as societal institutions that are founded upon the latter, rather than on pure philosophical wisdom. Had society chosen to value rather than condemn an educator and philosopher like Socrates, and to follow him towards this true knowledge, and toward what is good, virtuous, and worthwhile, society would have to place these sublime values and teaching as a crown over its numerous values and institutions and use them in its service. Thus, all of the things that hold value in society, honor, riches, knowledge, bodily pleasures, would be exposed as having no value in themselves, but only in as much as they serve the philosophical truth. By that, a society founded on lower values would lose its very identity as a culture that cares for and values bodily or materialistic pleasures, and it would have to undergo a complete transformation and adopt a new identity, a society that is devoted to a much higher but elusive and hidden metaphysical purpose. Now, Socrates' inquiry was characterized by a method of inquiry called the Socratic method, which is a method of questioning that was done always in dialogue with others. And it also rested on the wisdom of humility, that no matter how much knowledge or insight Socrates had, his wisdom was primarily in knowing that he did not really know. So he always pursued wisdom that was slightly beyond anything that was graspable. But I think in his final text, Phaedo, this perpetual inquiry and epistemological progress did result in the attainment of this great wisdom and truth that he had initially hoped to attain. And I think that implies there is a sort of leap in attaining and arriving at such true knowledge, where there's a process of sort of inquiry and constant rejection of one's current knowledge until a leap occurs, or a detachment from the reason and senses that are dubious into a reason and senses that offer conclusive, true sensations and information. And I think this leap is kind of similar to other evolutionary processes. But for the sake of time, I think I'm going to move on. again, I just want to underline again that Socrates' philosophy was always done in dialogue with others, and especially this last text, Phaedo, it was a conversation he had with his friends, which was a social act of dialogue and shared thinking in an amicable, heartfelt atmosphere. So I think that ensured this sort of leap in which his consciousness was able to make this attainment. And I think by building a similar social environment in a classroom with the aim of discovering this truth of nature, it's possible that others can achieve what Socrates had achieved. And this is what Socrates urges everyone to do. He says, one must make every effort to share in virtue and wisdom in one's life, for the reward is beautiful and the hope is great. Okay, now I'm going to move on to kind of jump forward a few millennia to Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. So again, Schopenhauer deals with the very similar theme as Socrates, but in a very different way, building on Plato, Socrates, as well as Immanuel Kant. Kant's famous writings, particularly his famous text, Critique of Pure Reason, discern the essence of the thing in itself, the only true existence underlying everything in reality. So Kant's philosophical direction was known as transcendental idealism. And then Schopenhauer extends Kant's thinking about this thing in itself and renaming it the will, which he says is the only fundamental existence in reality, situated beyond the phenomenological or physical reality and beyond time, space, and causality. The will is, again, the only true fundamental essence in existence, while all other things, the whole world and everything felt in it, are ideas or representations projected by this the will. And Schopenhauer says that the will, this fundamental existence in reality, is so different from anything human beings can know that it is unattainable, but at the same time, he makes it clear that it is the main object of inquiry that is worth knowing and pursuing, and that it should be pursued. So I think these sentiments, the impossibility of attaining this truth, yet kind of the importance of nevertheless pursuing it, I think it echoes the Socratic method of inquiry, and with this idea that a sort of leap, like an evolutionary leap of the human consciousness, is required to arrive at this knowledge of the will or the true state of reality. So again, compared to this sublime will, which is situated beyond time, space, and the physical world, all other things felt in the lower realm of reality, ideas or representations, they do not have an existence of their own, according to Schopenhauer. They are like phantoms projected outwards by their source in the superior dimension. So I'm going to read out a few quotes by Schopenhauer where he describes this. He says, the Vedas and Puranas, which is Indian philosophy or spirituality, the Vedas and Puranas have no better simile than a dream for the whole knowledge of the actual world. By the way, this is a quote from Schopenhauer's famous work, The World as Will and Representation. Again, he says, the Vedas and Puranas have no better simile than a dream for the whole knowledge of the actual world. Plato often says that men live only in a dream. The philosopher alone strives to awake himself. We are forced to concede to the poets that life is a long dream. What is this world of perception besides being my idea? This warns us to seek the inner nature of the world in an aspect of it which is quite different and quite distinct from the idea. Thus much is certain, that this something we seek for must be completely and in its whole nature different from the idea, that the forms and laws of the idea must therefore be completely foreign to it. whatever the thing in itself may be, Kant is right in his conclusion that time, space, and causality are not its properties, but come to it only after, and so far as it has become idea. This thing in itself is the will, and it lies outside of time and space. Will is this thing in itself, the inner content, the essence of the world. Life, the visible world, the phenomenon, is only the mirror of the will. Now, Nietzsche, another really influential philosopher, wrote a book, kind of an ode to Schopenhauer's life work called Schopenhauer as Educator, where Nietzsche writes that in his own pursuit of truth and knowledge, Schopenhauer was the very educator and philosopher for whom I have been searching all these years. Now I'm quoting Nietzsche from his book, Schopenhauer as Educator. Nietzsche also shares that Schopenhauer's fate was similar to Socrates in that he was kind of chose this vocation that's seeking the highest truth, the source of everything, and nothing less. But Schopenhauer, too, worked in stark and dangerous opposition to the society and institutions of his times. And specifically because he wanted to be an educator and not just a self-interested researcher. So both Socrates and Schopenhauer were endangered by their societies, not for their personal philosophical pursuits, but because they acted to influence or educate others with their wisdom. And I think this also implies that teaching or sharing one's own passion for philosophical inquiry with others is another necessary trait for anyone wishing to seriously engage in this kind of wisdom, despite the risks and dangers it might entail. I'm going to quote a quote by Nietzsche on this from this book. So Nietzsche writes, "A genius must not be afraid to place himself in the most hostile opposition to existing forms and orders if he means to bring the higher order and truth that lives inside him to light among his contemporaries." So I think that's a really beautiful quote by Nietzsche. And again, in another parallel to Socrates, that was always worked in a social context of dialogue with others, Nietzsche also points out, he says, even the greatest thinkers will be doomed without companions before whom they may be as open and plain as they are before themselves, which I think brings to mind this warm, heartfelt conversation Socrates had with his friends, in the course of which he reached and shared his greatest philosophical insights. Nietzsche further remarks that this path to truth, and again, this is a quote by Nietzsche, that it requires one to subdue his egocentrism and prepare the complete revolution and reversal in his nature that is the essential meaning of life. So again, he's talking about focusing outwards toward others rather than inwards towards one's ego or egocentrism, until one undergoes a complete revolution and reversal of human nature, a transformation that leads a person to the complete opposite of the original egocentric form. This is what Nietzsche writes here. So again, referring back to my introduction about this concept of this apocalyptic notion of kind of revelation of great knowledge, I think if we can imagine everyone in the world sort of undergoing this process described here by Nietzsche under the influence of the respective education, a process of the complete reversal and revolution of the egocentric human nature, resulting in essential meaning in life, then I think this notion of apocalypse or replacement of the old world with a new one through knowledge is a desirable and even realistic prospect. I just want to check on the time because I still have quite a long way to go in my paper, and I know I'm running short on time. I'm going to quote one more quote by Nietzsche from this book, which says Schopenhauer teaches us to distinguish between the real and the merely apparent causes of human happiness, how neither riches, nor honors, nor scholarly learning can raise one above desponding over the worthlessness of one's existence, and how the striving for such worldly goods can become meaningful only when it is illuminated by a higher, more complete purpose. All this only for oneself in the beginning, but eventually through oneself for everyone. Okay, next I wanted to talk about William James, who is kind of the founder of modern American psychology, but he was also influential for modern philosophy. Like the other thinkers, he speaks of this vast, infinitely beautiful, and significant objective or external reality, which is also an internal reality. Again, implying that these are metaphysical kind of descriptions, not physically external or internal. And James said that human beings would see this vast, significant reality if they overcame a universal human blindness, which is the inability to experience the world through others. And those who have not attained this ability simply remain blind to what actually exists around them. Again, repeating kind of Socrates' statement that regular bodily investigation of reality is full of deceit. I'm going to read a quote by James from his text, the blindness of human beings. The blindness in human beings is the blindness with which we are all afflicted in regard to the feelings of creatures and people different from ourselves. Only when the common practical man becomes a lover does the hard externality give way, and a gleam of insight into the objective world, the vast world of inner life beyond us, so different from that of outer seeming, illuminate our mind. This higher vision of an inner significance comes over a person suddenly, and when it does so, it makes an epoch in his history. There is a depth in those moments that constrains us to ascribe more reality to them than to all other experiences. Yet, so blind and dead does the clamor of our own practical interests make us to all other things, that it seems almost as if it were necessary to become worthless as a practical being if one is to hope to attain any breadth of insight into the impersonal world of worths as such, to have any perception of life's meaning on a large objective scale. Okay, I'm going to skip forward because I know I'm almost out of time to address the main philosopher of education, John Dewey, who was a very influential 20th century educational theorist in the United States, who really brought these sublime metaphysical concepts down to earth and removed kind of the veil of impenetrability or ethereal nature. John Dewey situates it directly in the everyday life and dealings of human society, but at the same time supports the same themes as these prior thinkers. Dewey also described a world that is experienced by most people as false and erroneous, calling it a world of dualisms, which are distinctions, oppositions, contrasts, and disconnected elements, whereas the truth of reality is continuity or integrality rather than dualism. And Dewey kind of proposes a gradual path of development by means of a social and moral education to arrive from one to the other. And Dewey was a very prolific philosopher. He wrote many books about education. I think as if he was kind of laying this thick bridge to ensure people could get from, the false reality to this true reality. And he was aware of kind of a sublime epistemological aim that is situated in kind of hidden secret layers of nature, but his chief focus was to provide broad access to it through educational institutions. So Dewey proposes a system of social and moral education, which cultivates harmonious connections between individuals and between individuals and the world, that exchanges between people in the social realm should be nurtured as the most valuable attributes of all educational processes. And this education occurs by means of the social environment or a direct experience of the continuity within the social environment. And remedying dualism, this false perception in the social realm, will remedy dualism everywhere. Again, Dewey did also emphasize that internality of the human beings is sort of takes precedence over externality, and that externality must be placed at the service of internality and realization of meaning. So I'm going to quote Dewey from his really landmark text, Democracy and Education. Dewey writes, what one gets and gives as a human being is not external possessions, but a widening and deepening of conscious life, an expanding realization of meaning. And what he materially receives and gives is at most opportunities for the evolution of conscious life. Otherwise, it is neither giving nor taking, but a shifting about of the position of things in space. I'm going to skip my next section, which was going to discuss the neoliberalist thinkers, Foucault, Wilson, and Brown, who basically exposed that the current state of society is the exact opposite of everything that these philosophers have talked about, that our society at present has reached the extreme of neoliberalistic development, or kind of obsession with external materialistic forms that have dominated every aspect of human life. I'm just going to read one quote by Wendy Brown. Neoliberalism, which reduces everything to egocentrism and market value netto, is the rationality through which capitalism finally swallows humanity. And again, these neoliberalist thinkers reach the conclusion that the solution to this crisis of modern society is to create shared spaces of connection, to engage in care of others and connection with others. Okay, and I think I have reached the conclusion of my paper, which is titled Principles of a New Education. So again, our knowledge of an experience of reality is shaped by the education we receive, both formal and informal. And the values and experiences imparted by any education are determined by its aims. So if education's aim is to impart knowledge of truth, or this true reality, it would seem that the notion of education would have to be created anew from a completely clean slate. Now, lack of knowledge or even interest in the true reality is currently perpetuated by education that does not set knowledge of the true reality as its aim. Education today is still guided by neoliberalist ideals, values, and aims. So the average person's notions of education was likewise formed by their education, which did not pursue truth and objectivity. Now, if we accept the philosopher's view of what is worthwhile, this attainment of truth, this would have to become the new aim of education. And then we would establish the methods and skills imparted by such an education. So William James and John Dewey all indicate that a necessary skill for accessing this true knowledge is the ability to feel the world through others, to have qualities of empathy and genuine care for others, and kind of with the awareness that these are a means for an encounter with greatness, vastness, eternity, infinity, perfection, meaning, and ultimate purpose. Now, I think the principle of social connection as a means to a sublime purpose is really the main and only principle around which educators can design any sort of learning experiences, using even standard curriculum such as science, geography, language, the arts. What matters is the educator's awareness of education's aim and unceasing care to ensure that the social environment in the classroom always prizes positive social and interpersonal connection. Now, aside from creating this environment in the classroom, the educators themselves must engage in the same kinds of social environment. So the staff of the school or educational institutions must be engaged in these experiences daily on a regular basis, where they too will operate as a cohesive social environment of adults in order to sustain the same kind of environment among children and to educate through personal example. Okay, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. And we can see that we have a very vast field to research in this human development. So we're going to have more investigation and more material for the next conference. Thank you very much, Keren Levina. Thank you for this amazing talk.